Find the late start of activity B. In this problem, we know the early start of activity A equals 1. We are also provided a table showing the list of activities, their durations, and predecessor activities. From this table, we notice the first activity, framing, has no predecessor activities. Once framing is complete, activities B, C, and D relating to the installation of windows, doors, and insulation can begin, because framing activity A is the only predecessor of these three subsequent activities. After windows, doors, and insulation are complete, inspection can begin. We'll set up a network diagram for these 5 activities. The problem asks to find the late start of activity B, window installation. The late start of activity B equals the late finish of activity B minus the duration of activity B. The given activity table provides the duration for activity B equals 2. So we can plug in 2 for variable dB. The late finish of activity B equals the late start of activity E, because activity E is the only successor of activity B. The late start of activity E equals the late finish of activity E minus the duration of activity E. From the activity table, the duration of activity E equals 1. The late finish of activity E equals the early finish of activity E, because activity E, the inspection, is the final activity. The early finish of activity E equals the early start of activity E plus the duration of activity E. From before, we know the duration of activity E equals 1. The early start of activity E equals the maximum value between the early finish of activity B, the early finish of activity C, and the early finish of activity D, because inspection cannot begin until all 3 of these activities have been completed. The problem provides the durations required for each activities B, C, and D, which are 2, 3, and 1, respectively. Therefore, the early finish of these 3 activities equals the early start plus the duration. And we know the duration is equal to 3 and 1. Since the only predecessor of activity B, C, and D is activity A, the framing, we know the early start of activities B, C, and D equal the early finish of activity A. The early finish of activity A equals the early start of activity A plus the duration of activity A. The problem statement provides the early start